Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. Today I'm thinking about remote working and how good it is for us really. I've realised I spend many hours of my week squirreled away on my computer, and in some ways it works incredibly well for me. I get to do the work I love, coaching and training people from all over the world, and it also gives me the freedom to add in my own interests. I especially love it when there's a major tennis tournament on television for me to catch up on, which I wouldn't be able to do if I was in an office. I wouldn't be able to watch Wimbledon whilst having a quick cup of tea. But sometimes I wonder whether the connection is just an illusion. We talk about living in the virtual world, and that's all it is when it comes down to it. Virtual, not complete. So what is it doing for us and to us? And should we strive for more of this or less? Remote working was a thing before the pandemic, although if I'm honest, I'm not sure how much work I really did when I worked from home in those days. But as we know, COVID changed the world in many ways, including the way that we work. On the face of it, it's incredibly attractive. To quote Dolly Parton, we could literally tumble out of bed, stumble to the kitchen, and whilst we're pouring out our first cup of ambition for the day, we could be logging on and getting on with our day's work. Possibly with our laptop on the kitchen table, but definitely without having to be shoved up against strangers on public transport. Then at the end of the day, all we had to do was log off, close our computers, and enjoy our downtime. Sounds great. Maybe for a couple of days it can feel like we're having it all, but it's not everything. Where we gain, we also lose, and it's just possible that the gains aren't worth the losses. The key thing for me is the term remote, and that's what really happens to us when we're all working virtually. We become remote and separated from each other, and that's where our defences can creep in. In episode 2, we looked at several of the defence mechanisms and the part they can play in our relationships, holding us back and impacting the way that we communicate with people. They act as an interference in how we bond and build relationships with people. Sometimes we absolutely need our defences to keep us safe in relationships that don't serve us, and at others they can get in the way of us communicating in a healthy and productive manner. When we're with people in person, our unconscious is picking up signs and signals from other people, making connections and possibly filling in the gaps for us. We're responding to what's in front of us and the conscious and unconscious flow of information that is happening all around us. Our psychic system has a tried and tested way of responding to the real world that we live in. So what can happen when we work remotely that impacts our psychic system in a different way? To start with, we don't have access to the same amount of information that we would do in person. Body language, people's energy, even tone of voice can sound different on Zoom, and definitely text messages and emails can be misinterpreted and misread. I know I've done that. It then becomes a challenge to work out what is going on with other people, which can then cause us anxiety, and when we get anxious, our defence mechanisms get activated. We aren't spending the same amount of time physically around people, so we can't pick up clues from their unconscious behaviour. As we aren't spending so much time with people, there are a lot of gaps in our awareness about what is happening. And to help defend against the anxiety that not knowing causes us, we can make up stories and meanings and then project these narratives onto other people. We can construct a false reality for ourselves, and we can fall into this constructed reality, separating us more and more from what is actually happening. We then run the risk of becoming completely isolated from the people that we work with and the organisations that we're part of. As this persists and continues, we can then either rationalise about why we're doing what we're doing and why we stay working remotely, or we can intellectualise about how the world has changed and that this is the way forward. The phrase "the new normal" is one that is less common than it was during the pandemic, but is definitely still used to describe where we are at the moment. Other people can also make up stories and narratives about us and project their own failings and insecurities onto us. We can then pick these feelings up and they become part of us, even though they aren't actually ours. What is happening here is projective identification. The other person has a part of themselves that they don't like very much, so they push it outside of themselves and attribute it to someone else, potentially us. We then identify with that feeling and make it part of ourselves. It becomes our own feeling. Have a think about when you have felt a particular way and been surprised by how you were feeling. where you have picked up someone else's feelings and introjected them into yourself. This can be tricky for us to be aware of and can take a bit of practice to start noticing within ourselves. It is worth pursuing and practicing what we notice is and isn't ours, because then we can start to think about how we give things back to people. Spending long periods of time alone isn't necessarily good for us. We all need some time to ourselves and some downtime, but spending huge amounts of time alone gives us time to create stories in our minds. Our worlds become smaller, and therefore small things become more important to us than would normally happen. If we perceive something that makes us anxious, we can then feel inclined to isolate ourselves further, so that we remove ourselves from more potential sources of anxiety. Human beings are pack animals though, and back in prehistoric times, being away from the tribe literally threatened our survival, and this need to belong is something deep within us. Our bodies also aren't designed to spend long periods of time immobile, and you could argue that a commute at least gives you the opportunity to move around a little bit. And this is the point where all those aches and pains can creep in, because we aren't moving that much. We might be more disposed to somatisation, where we don't intellectually recognise or bring into our conscious minds what we're struggling with or defend against, but our bodies definitely let us know that something's wrong. Denial can abound whilst we're working on our own. It becomes easy for us to deny something has happened. We can deny that we received an email or that a particular conversation was had. We can also deny to ourselves that maybe we miss being part of the real world. Sitting at home potentially working in our pyjamas can be quite seductive. I've definitely had days when the thought of getting up and doing the full getting ready routine seems a bit much, but once I'm up and ready to go, I usually feel better for it. And this is linked to the general anxiety of going back into the world. We might dismiss this to ourselves and think that really doesn't matter to us, that we're fine about everything. But the pandemic impacted us all, and whilst it might not be present in our conscious minds, our unconscious minds are very well aware of the effect that it had on us. So maybe it's easier to deny to ourselves that getting out there is a good thing after all. And maybe we will just treat ourselves to one more biscuit while scrolling through Instagram before we start work. Misinterpretations are so much more likely to happen when we're working remotely. These can lead us into all kinds of defensive behaviours. If we feel that we're being attacked by an email or a message that we misinterpret, we can then displace this anxiety elsewhere, either in our work or in our home lives. And if we're working at home, then it becomes increasingly likely that the cat is going to get kicked or the fridge door slammed. We've nowhere to leave our anxiety. Not that we ever do truly leave our anxiety. However, it is easier to locate at least part of it in a different environment. The physical act of leaving a space, for example an office, can give us some respite for our anxious feelings and help us feel that we have at least a bit of control over the situation. And being away from the workplace often means that we don't see the nuances in people's behaviours. We only have our environment to base our thoughts and assumptions on, and this can lead us to splitting, where we decide something is either all good or all bad. Sometimes we do this because it's an easier way to think. We don't have to or don't want to consider all the options or variances in a particular situation or relationship. Maybe we've invested time and effort into this situation or relationship, and to let it go would cause us anxiety. We might not know what's next, and that scares us. Or we might not want to think about what our part in the situation is. If we can disown all responsibility for what's happening and split it off into the other person, then the anxiety that we carry can become greatly reduced. So on reflection, whilst there are many plus points to working from home, there are also many areas where it might cause us more anxiety than we'd at first considered. If you're experiencing anxiety and you aren't sure where this is coming from, it could be worth having a think about whether working from home is having an added impact on what might be going on for you. Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet and you can find the link for this in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.